The air in the private hospital wing was so sterile it had a sound, a low, electric hum that vibrated just beneath the threshold of hearing. It was the sound of money, of isolation, of power so absolute it could bend the rules of a public institution into a private fortress. At the center of this fortress, in a room painted a calming, impersonal shade of eggshell, sat Quan Jae-hwan. He was a man built of quiet contradictions. His suit, now draped over the back of a visitor's chair, was a bespoke charcoal masterpiece, but the white button-down shirt he wore was stark, almost monastic. His posture was unnervingly still, a predator at rest, yet his eyes missed nothing. They followed the young woman who had just entered the room, tracking her movements with an intensity that made the two guards flanking the doorway tense their shoulders. Their names were Minjun and Sungho, and for 11 years, their primary duty had been to ensure no one got this close to their boss without an invitation written in blood. The woman, however, seemed oblivious to the weight of their scrutiny. Her dark green scrubs were crisp, professional. She was young, maybe 22, with warm, dark skin that seemed to absorb the room's cold, artificial light and soften it. Her name was Lena Washington, and her expression was one of calm, clinical focus. She carried a small metal tray with antiseptic wipes, sterile gauze, and a jar of medicated salve. She placed it on the stand beside the examination table with a soft, decisive click. For a full minute, no one spoke. The silence was a language Jae-hwan understood better than any other. It was a tool, a weapon, a space where lesser men revealed their weaknesses. But this woman's silence was different. It wasn't deference, it was preparation. "Mr. Kwan," she said, her voice even and low, cutting through the hum. "I'm Lena, the wound care specialist. Dr. Chen asked me to take a look at the inflammation. If you're ready, you can remove your shirt and have a seat on the edge of the table." Her tone was not a request. It was a gentle instruction, the kind one gives 1,000 times a day, stripped of any fear or awe. Minjun took a half step forward, his hand twitching almost imperceptibly toward his jacket. Sungho simply stared, his jaw tight. They had seen men with more power than a city mayor tremble before offering Jae-hwan a cup of tea. Jae-hwan watched her, not them. He was studying the way she organized her supplies, the efficiency in her movements. There was no hesitation, no tremor in her hands. He gave a short, almost invisible nod to his men, and they receded, melting back into their positions by the door, their disapproval a palpable force in the room. Slowly, deliberately, he began to unbutton his shirt. The fabric was fine Egyptian cotton, and the buttons were mother of pearl. Each one slipped free with a quiet sigh. As the shirt parted, it revealed a chest and abdomen corded with muscle, a landscape of discipline and strength. But that was not the part of him the world wasn't allowed to see. He shrugged the shirt from his shoulders, letting it fall into his lap, and turned his back to her. The gasp from the hallway was sharp, instantly suppressed. Minjun had failed to conceal his reaction. Even after 11 years, the sight was jarring. Jae-hwan's back was a cartography of violence. A brutal, chaotic map of scars that crisscrossed from his shoulders down to his waist. Some were thin, silvery lines, relics of old, clean cuts. Others were thick, keloid ridges, angry and raised, the kind of tissue that forms when a wound is deep, dirty, and left to heal on its own terms. These were the ones that were inflamed, patches of red weeping at the edges of the hardened tissue. It was a history written on skin, a testament to a single, horrific event that had redefined him. For 11 years, no one had touched the skin. Tailors took his measurements with agonizing care, never letting the tape measure rest directly against his back. Doctors had offered treatments from a distance, prescribing oral antibiotics and anti-inflammatories, but none had ever dared to suggest a topical application. It was an unspoken rule. The past was not to be touched. Lena drew in a soft breath, but it wasn't a gasp of horror. It was a clinical intake of air, the sound of a professional assessing her work. She moved closer, the subtle scent of antiseptic soap following her. Jae-hwan's entire body went rigid. Every muscle in his back locked, the old scars pulling the skin taut. He could feel the heat radiating from her body, the the change in the air pressure as she came to stand directly behind him. He braced for a flinch, for a hesitation, for the recoil that always came when people saw the truth of him. He waited. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He could hear his own heart, a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He could feel the eyes of his men boring into the back of her head, willing her to fail, to retreat, to understand her place. Then he felt it. A touch. It was not the accidental brush of a stranger in a crowd or the clinical tap of a doctor's tool. It was the firm, cool pressure of a gloved fingertip, placed directly beside the most inflamed ridge of scar tissue. It was gentle, yet impossibly solid. A single point of contact in a universe of isolation. Jae-hwan didn't flinch. He didn't breathe. An electric shock, cold and sharp, shot up his spine. It wasn't pain. It was something else entirely. It was the sensation of a door being opened into a room that had been sealed for over a decade. He felt the memory of it, the fire, the broken glass, the feeling of his own life spilling out onto a cold stone floor. The memories were always there, a low hum beneath the surface, but this touch gave them a voice, a shape. He could almost feel the phantom edges of the blades that had carved this ruin into him. The touch was so foreign, so utterly alien after years of guarded distance, that his body's first instinct was to interpret it as a threat. His shoulders bunched, preparing for a blow that never came. The pressure from her finger remained steady, diagnostic. "The tissue is heavily granulated," Lena said, her voice just as calm as before, as if she were discussing a diagram in a textbook. "It's pulling on the surrounding skin, which is causing the irritation. And it looks like a minor localized infection is setting in on this one here." Her finger traced the edge of a particularly vicious scar, a starburst of raised flesh near his left shoulder blade. Jae-hwan's breath hitched, a tiny, involuntary sound he hadn't made in front of another person since he was a boy. He was a man who had built an empire on the foundation of his own impenetrable control. He had faced down assassins, negotiated with cartels, and stared into the eyes of traitors without a flicker of emotion. Yet the methodical, unimpressed touch of this young nurse was unraveling him thread by thread. He remained perfectly still, a statue of coiled tension, his hands gripping the edge of the examination table so hard his knuckles turned white. He was acutely aware of Min-jun and Sung-ho in the hall, their loyalty warring with their shock. They were witnessing the impossible. Someone was touching the untouchable part of their leader, and he was allowing it. Lena worked with a quiet efficiency that was both unnerving and profoundly calming. She tore open an antiseptic wipe, the small rip of the foil packet echoing in the silent room. "This will be cold," she warned, a simple courtesy that felt monumental. The wipe was not just cold. It was a jolt of clean, sharp reality against the dull, chronic ache of the scar tissue. He grit his teeth against the sting, the scent of alcohol filling the air. She cleaned the area with meticulous care, her movements sure and practiced. She saw the skin not as a record of his pain, but as a surface that needed to be treated. To her, these were not the legendary wounds of the head of the Golden Dragon Syndicate. They were simply dermal layers, inflamed and in need of care. Her detachment was, in its own way, a form of respect. She wasn't treating the myth. She was treating the man. After cleaning the area, she took a sterile swab and gently collected a sample from the weeping edge of the scar. "I'll send this to the lab, just to be sure we're using the right antibiotic in the salve," she explained, her voice a low murmur. She worked as if she were alone in the room, her focus entirely on the task before her. Jae-hwan found himself tracking the rhythm of her breathing. It was slow and even, a quiet anchor in the storm of sensation and memory that was roaring through him. For 11 years, his back had been a dead zone, a part of himself he acknowledged but did not feel. It was a testament to his survival, but it was also a wall. Now, under her hands, it was waking up. Nerves that had been dormant for a decade screamed with a confused mixture of pain and relief. He could feel the texture of her latex glove against his skin, the subtle shift in pressure as she moved from one area to another. It was an intimacy so profound and so unwanted that it bordered on violation, yet her professionalism held it firmly in the realm of medicine. She opened the jar of salve. The scent was clean, medicinal with a hint of eucalyptus. She scooped a small amount onto a fresh glove. "All right, Mr. Kwan. I'm going to apply the dressing now. You'll feel some pressure." He gave a curt nod, his eyes fixed on the reflection of the room in the polished chrome of a medical instrument stand. He saw her distorted figure behind him, a shape of green against the white walls. He saw his own rigid posture. He looked like a man preparing for an execution. Her hand, now coated in the cool salve, settled on his back. This touch was different. It wasn't a single point of a fingertip. It was the broad, firm pressure of her entire palm, moving in a slow, circular motion to work the medicine into the inflamed tissue. Jae-hwan's world narrowed to that single point of contact. The cold of the salve seeped into his skin, a soothing fire that chased away the angry heat of the infection. Her hand was strong, her pressure unwavering. She was not afraid of the damage. She was not repulsed by the ugliness of it. She was methodically, patiently healing it. And in that moment, something inside Kwon Jae-hwan, something that had been encased in ice for 4,015 days, began to thaw. He didn't realize he had closed his eyes until he heard her voice again, pulling him back to the surface. "There. That's done." He opened them. The room was the same. The low hum of the air filtration system was the same. His men were still standing guard. But everything had changed. He could feel the light, cool weight of the gauze and medical tape on his back, a strange new sensation. He could still feel the phantom pressure of her hand. Slowly, he reached for his shirt, his movements stiff. He did not turn to look at her. He could not. "You'll need this changed every 24 hours for the next week," she said, her tone businesslike as she disposed of the used materials. "I can come back tomorrow around the same time, or you can have one of the floor nurses do it." The implication was clear. He was a patient like any other. The choice was his. Min-jun stepped into the doorway. "We will handle it from here," he said, his voice clipped and possessive. It was a dismissal. Lena looked from the guard to the unmoving back of the man on the table. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine. She ignored Min-jun completely. "Mr. Kwan?" she asked, her voice cutting through the guard's authority. "What would you prefer?" The room fell silent again. Min-jun's face darkened with indignation. No one questioned an order given in Jae-hwan's presence unless it came from Jae-hwan himself. Jae-hwan finished buttoning his shirt, the small movements precise and controlled. He stood up and turned to face her for the first time since she'd touched him. His face was a mask of neutrality, but his eyes, dark and deep, held a new light. It was not gratitude. It was something far more complex. It was recognition. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice a low rasp. The same time, he held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of the boundary she had crossed and the strange, new territory they now occupied. Then, without another word, he walked out of the room, his two guards falling into step behind him, leaving Lena alone with the quiet hum of the air and the lingering scent of antiseptic. She stood there for a moment, her own composure finally wavering. Her hands, which had been so steady, now trembled ever so slightly. She hadn't been treating a man. She had been handling a live bomb, and only now did she allow herself to feel the aftershock. The following day, the tension was a different vintage. It was no longer the sharp, aggressive fear of the unknown, but the heavy, watchful silence of anticipation. When Lena arrived at precisely 2 o'clock, carrying her small tray, Min-jun and Sung-ho simply nodded and stepped aside. They had their orders. Inside, Jae-hwan was already waiting, seated on the edge of the examination table, his back to the door. His white shirt was folded neatly on the chair beside him. He did not acknowledge her entrance, but she could see the subtle shift in his posture, the way his shoulders prepared for her presence. This time, there was a rhythm to it, a ritual. She set down her tray, washed her hands, and put on a fresh pair of gloves. The silence was still there, but it felt less like a void and more like a space they were sharing. "How did it feel overnight?" she asked, her voice calm as she began to gently peel back the tape from the previous day's dressing. He didn't answer immediately. He was a man who used words as currency, and he spent them sparingly. He considered the question not as a simple pleasantry, but as a request for data. Less tight, he finally said, the words sounding strange in his own mouth. He never spoke of his body, of its feelings or its failings. It was a machine, a tool. To admit it felt anything was a concession. Lena nodded, accepting the report. That's good. The inflammation is already starting to go down. She disposed of the old dressing and began cleaning the area as she had before. The skin was less angry today, the redness receding from the edges of the keloid ridges. Jae-hwan found himself focusing on the sensation, trying to dissect it. Yesterday, her touch had been a shock to his system. Today, it was an expectation. His body still tensed when she first made contact, a deeply ingrained reflex, but the tension dissipated more quickly. He was learning the feel of her hands, the specific pressure she used, the cool slide of the antiseptic wipe. It was becoming a known quantity, and in his world, knowledge was control. You're very young to be a specialist, he said, the observation dropping into the quiet room without preamble. It was a test, a probe into her history. Lena didn't miss a beat. I'm 22, she replied, her focus remaining on his back. I graduated from my program early. I like the work. It's methodical. You see a problem. You treat it. You see the results. Her answer was direct, factual, and offered no personal details beyond what was necessary. She was not intimidated by his attempt to profile her. She was defining the terms of their interaction. She was a professional, and this was her job. He respected that. It was a language he understood. Power was not always about aggression. Sometimes it was about holding your frame, about refusing to be moved. She applied the fresh salve, her movements as sure and steady as they had been the day before. He found himself breathing in time with the circular motions of her hand, a slow, calming rhythm that seemed to loosen something deep in his chest. He was so accustomed to being in command, to being the unmovable center of his universe, that this passive state of receiving care was profoundly disorienting. He was not in control, and yet, for the first time in a long time, he did not feel threatened by it. As she was applying the new dressing, taping the edges with neat, precise strips, he spoke again. Why were you not afraid? It was the real question. The one his men were asking themselves. The one that had been echoing in his own mind for the last 24 hours. Lena pressed down the final piece of tape, her work complete. She began to strip off her gloves, turning to face him as she did. Her eyes were clear and direct. Fear is a distraction, she said simply. My job is to see the wound, not the man it's attached to. When I'm working, that's all there is. Tissue, bacteria, inflammation. The story of how it got there isn't my business. Fixing it is. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something beyond her clinical professionalism. It was not pity. It was a profound, almost startling, sense of empathy contained within the boundaries of her duty. Everyone deserves to heal, Mr. Kwan. No matter how they got their scars. With that, she gathered her things and left. Jae-hwan remained seated on the table long after she was gone, the echo of her words hanging in the sterile air. Everyone deserves to heal. It was a concept so foreign to his world, a world built on retribution and the permanence of past transgressions, that it felt like a line from a forgotten language. He had always viewed his scars as a brand, a permanent reminder of the price of betrayal and the cost of his own survival. They were a part of his armor, a declaration of what he had endured. He had never once considered them something that could, or should, be healed. The routine continued for 4 more days. Each afternoon at 2 o'clock, Lena would arrive. The guards would nod. Jae-hwan would be waiting, his shirt already off. The silence would settle around them, comfortable now, familiar. They rarely spoke, but a silent conversation was taking place. With each treatment, Jae-hwan's body unlearned a little more of its tension. He no longer braced for her touch. He found his muscles relaxing under her hands, a small, involuntary surrender. He started to notice small things about her. The way she tucked a stray braid behind her ear when she was concentrating, the small, focused frown that appeared between her eyebrows as she assessed the healing, the quiet confidence in her posture. She, in turn, learned to read the subtle shifts in him. She could tell by the set of his shoulders if he was having a particularly stressful day. She could see the minute relaxation of the muscles along his spine as the cool salve began to work. They were two people from entirely different universes, communicating through the medium of damaged skin and clinical care. On the sixth day, something was different. The air outside the hospital was heavy with the coming rain, and the mood inside the private wing was electric with a new, sharper tension. Minjun and Sungho were not just watchful. They were agitated. Their eyes darted toward the windows, their hands never far from their weapons. Jaehwan was already in the room when Lena arrived, but he was not seated on the table. He was standing by the window, staring down at the rain-slicked Seoul streets below. He was fully dressed, his charcoal suit a suit of armor. He turned as she entered, and she saw it immediately. A fresh cut, thin and precise, just above his right eyebrow. It was still bleeding slightly. And there was a darkness in his eyes, a controlled fury that seemed to make the very air in the room colder. "Mr. Kwon," she said, her voice steady despite the sudden shift in atmosphere. "There's been a change of plans," he said, his voice a low growl. "Your services will no longer be required here." Minjun stepped forward, as if to escort her out. Lena stood her ground. She looked from Jaehwan's cold expression to the fresh wound on his face. She knew this language. This was the world of violence and consequences reasserting itself. "The treatment isn't finished," she said, her gaze unwavering. "The infection is gone, but the tissue is still fragile. If you stop now, it will only get inflamed again. You'll be back where you started. That is not your concern," Jaehwan countered, his voice dangerously soft. "My concerns are my own, my concern," she shot back, her professionalism giving her a unique brand of courage, "is my patient. And right now, my patient is standing in front of me with a fresh laceration on his face that needs to be cleaned and closed, and a course of treatment on his back that he's about to abandon for reasons that have nothing to do with his health." Minjun looked at Jaehwan, expecting the order to remove her, forcefully if necessary. But Jaehwan was silent. He was watching her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He had not been spoken to with such direct, unvarnished defiance in over a decade. Everyone in his life deferred to him, obeyed him, or feared him. This young woman did none of those things. She simply stated facts. She held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Sit down, Mr. Kwon," she said, her voice softening slightly, but losing none of its authority. "Let me take care of your face. Then we can finish what we started." For a long, tense moment, the standoff held. The silent war between his world of violence and her world of healing played out in the space between them. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to cost him a great deal, Kwon Jaehwan broke eye contact. He walked to the examination table, unbuttoned his suit jacket, and sat down. He did not take off his shirt this time. He simply tilted his head, giving her access to the cut above his eye. Minjun's jaw practically hit the floor. Lena retrieved a different kit from the hospital supply closet in the hall, one meant for sutures. She worked with the same quiet focus she always did, cleaning the cut with an antiseptic that made him hiss in a sharp intake of breath. "This one was clean," she observed, her fingers gently probing the edges of the wound. "A knife, not glass," he said nothing. He just watched her face, her brow furrowed in concentration as she prepared a tiny needle and a thread of black suture silk. "You need to be still," she murmured, her voice close to his ear. Her left hand came up to steady his head, her fingers resting gently against his temple. Her touch was warm, solid. It was the first time she had touched him skin to skin, without the barrier of a glove. The contact was electric. He could feel the faint, steady pulse in her fingertips against his skin. It felt more intimate than any of the treatments on his back. He closed his eyes as the needle pierced his skin. He didn't flinch. He had endured so much worse. But this pain was different. It was a clean, healing pain, administered by a hand that meant him no harm. As she worked, stitching the skin together with small, Perfect knots. The tension in the room began to subside. The act of healing, of mending what was broken, was a powerful antidote to the violence that had preceded it. When she was finished, she placed a small butterfly bandage over the stitches. "There," she said softly. "It should heal with minimal scarring." He opened his eyes. Her face was very close to his. He could see the faint flecks of gold in her brown eyes, the serious set of her mouth. He could feel her breath on his cheek. The world outside, with its rival gangs and bloody disputes, seemed to fade away. In this sterile white room, there was only this quiet, focused act of care. "My back," he said, his voice rough. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an admission, a surrender. Lena nodded. She waited as he removed his jacket and shirt, his movements slower this time, more deliberate. When he turned his back to her, she saw that the skin was calm, the angry redness almost completely gone. The great, jagged ridges of scar tissue remained, a permanent part of him, but they were no longer at war with the rest of his body. She began the final treatment, her hands moving in the familiar, rhythmic pattern. The silence returned, but it was deeper now, filled with all the things they had not said. "They were a message," he said suddenly, his voice low and strained. He had not spoken of the scar's origin before, and Lena's hands paused for a fraction of a second before continuing their steady work. "From a man I once called my brother. He wanted to make sure I would never forget the price of trust." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The story was written on his skin. Lena didn't offer empty words of sympathy. She didn't say she was sorry. She simply continued her work, her steady, healing touch, a more profound response than any words could be. Her pressure was firm, reassuring. It said, "I am here. I am not afraid of your past. I am mending the present." When she was finished, she placed the final dressing on his back. The week of treatment was over. "You're done," she said quietly. "The tissue is stable. Just keep it clean and dry. The residual inflammation will fade on its own." Jae-hwan stood and put on his shirt. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. He held it out to her. "For your time," he said. It was a dismissal, a payment, a way to put their interaction back into a box he understood, a transaction. Lena looked at the envelope, then back at his face. She didn't take it. "I'm an employee of the hospital, Mr. Kwan," she said, her voice polite but firm. "They've already been compensated for my time. Extravagantly, I'm sure." He lowered the envelope, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He was not used to people refusing his money.
"Then
"What?" he asked, the question hanging in the air. What did she want? What was her angle? In his world, everyone wanted something. "I want you to take care of the stitches," she said, tapping her own forehead in the spot where she had just mended his. "And maybe try to avoid getting any new ones." It was the closest she had ever come to giving him advice, to stepping outside the bounds of her professional role.
it was a simple human request."
It was also the most profound thing anyone had said to him in years. He stared at her, this young woman who had walked into his fortified life, touched his deepest wound, and asked for nothing in return. She had faced his power, his reputation, and his violence, and had offered only competence and compassion. She had healed more than just a patch of irritated skin. She had reminded him that he was made of tissue, not just of iron and memory. A slow, almost imperceptible change happened in his face. The hard lines around his mouth softened. The coldness in his eyes warmed by a single degree. "Lena," he said, speaking her first name for the very first time. The sound of it in his voice was both strange and fitting. "Thank you." She gave him a small, professional nod, but a genuine smile touched her lips for the first time. "You're welcome, Jae-hwan." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the center of the room. He watched her go, the envelope still heavy in his hand. He felt the light pull of the new stitches above his eye and the cool, clean feeling of the final dressing on his back. For the first time in 11 years, the weight on his shoulders felt just a little bit lighter. The past was still there, etched into his skin, but it no longer had the same power. A door had been opened, and a little bit of light had been let in. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were a return to his normal, but the definition of normal had been fundamentally altered. Jae-hwan moved through his world of high-stakes negotiations and veiled threats with his usual cold precision, but there was a new awareness in him. He was more conscious of his own body, of the way he moved, of the permanent geography of his back. The dressing was gone now, and the skin beneath was calm. He found himself, in rare private moments, standing before a mirror, looking at the reflection of his own history. The scars were the same, but his perception of them had shifted. They were no longer just a monument to betrayal. They were also the place where a stranger had shown him a kindness so profound it had breached his defenses. The cut above his eye healed cleanly, just as she had promised. The day he had the stitches removed by a discreet doctor who asked no questions, he felt a strange sense of loss. The stitches had been a tangible link to her, a reminder of her steady hands and her fearless gaze. He sent Minjun to the hospital with a donation to the Nursing Education Fund, a sum so large it was anonymous by necessity. It was a gesture that was both impersonal and deeply personal, a payment made not to her, but for her, a way of honoring her world from the safe distance of his own. About a month later, a new threat emerged, the one that had been simmering on the day she had stitched his face. A rival faction, the Black Vipers, grew bold, making a move on his territory in the Port District. It was a direct challenge, one that demanded a swift and brutal response. The old Jae-hwan, the one from before Treatment Room 7B, would have responded with overwhelming force, making an example of them that would be whispered about for years. His lieutenants gathered in his office, a sleek, minimalist space of glass and steel overlooking the city. They presented him with plans for retaliation, their faces grim and eager for blood. Minjun detailed the strategy: a coordinated strike on their warehouses, a public display of power. It was the language Jae-hwan had spoken his entire adult life. He listened silently, his face an impassive mask. He stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to his men. He saw the city lights sprawling below, a kingdom he had built on a foundation of fear and control. He thought of Lena's words: "Everyone deserves to heal. Avoid getting any new ones." It was absurd. It was naive. It had no place in this world of violence and power. And yet it did. He thought about the cycle of it all. The violence that had carved up his own back had been a response to another act of violence, which was itself a response to another. It was a snake eating its own tail, a fire that consumed everything and created nothing. He turned back to face his men. The room was silent, waiting for his command. "No," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. A ripple of shock went through the room.
Minun's eyes widened.
"Sir? They have challenged us directly. To not respond with force would be seen as weakness." Jae-hwan finished for him. "I know what it would be seen as." He walked back to his desk, but he didn't sit down. He leaned against it, a position of casual authority. "We will not burn their warehouses. We will not put their men in the hospital." He paused, letting the weight of his heresy settle. "Instead, we will buy the Port Authority. We will cut off their supply chain at the source. We will bankrupt them without firing a single shot." It was a move of immense power, but it was a different kind of power. It was strategic, not visceral. It was about building, not just destroying. It was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. His men were stunned into silence. It was a brilliant move, a checkmate that would neutralize the Vipers far more permanently than a street war ever could. But it was not his usual style. It was elegant, controlled. It was the move of a man who no longer felt the need to prove his capacity for brutality. The plan was set in motion. It worked flawlessly. The Black Vipers withered on the vine, choked off from their lifeblood, and their organization crumbled within weeks. There was no bloodshed. No new scars created on either side. One evening, Jae-hwan found himself driving, with no destination in mind. He ended up in the neighborhood, near the hospital. On an impulse he didn't fully understand, he parked his car and walked. The night air was cool and clean. He passed by a small, brightly lit cafe and saw her. Lena was sitting at a table by the window with a group of friends, all of them in civilian clothes. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her smile radiant and unburdened. She looked young, happy, and completely ordinary. She was a woman who lived in a world of light and laughter, a world he could only ever observe from the outside. He stood across the street in the shadows, watching for a long time. He felt a strange ache in his chest, a feeling he couldn't name. It wasn't just desire. It was a kind of reverence. She had given him a gift he didn't know he needed, and he could never repay it. He could only honor it by trying to become a man worthy of it. He finally turned and walked back to his car. He did not go in. He did not interrupt her life with the shadow of his own. Some things were too precious to be touched by his world. But as he drove away, he knew that the quiet, 22-year-old nurse had left a permanent mark on him, one more profound than any scar. She had not erased his past, but she had shown him that it did not have to be his entire future. She had taught him that the most powerful act was not to break, but to mend. And in the silent, protected fortress of his heart, Quan Jae Hwan was, at last, beginning to heal.